Hello there. Thanks for tuning in to Under the Dome on Town Meeting TV. My name's Bobby Lucier. The legislative session has wrapped up. The veto session has wrapped up. We are on the other side of the biennium, and we are now speaking with some advocates who were working in the Statehouse this year to learn a little bit more, not just about the issues that they were working on, but also to try and unpack the legislative process and what it looks like to build relationships with lawmakers and to work on the issues that you're trying to advance. And today we are very lucky to be joined by Jana Ossoff from Free Her Vermont and Brenda Siegel from End Homelessness Vermont. So thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So maybe we'll start with some introductions. Could you both just share a little bit about the organization that you work for and what your work looks like on the day-to-day? And we can start with you, Jana.
Okay. My name is Jana Ossoff. I use she, her pronouns, and I lead the Free Her campaign. And we're a campaign of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. Our explicit goal is to end incarceration for women, girls, trans, and non-binary people. And we do that mainly through 3 buckets of advocacy, which is why we're in the Statehouse, reimagining communities, which is mutual aid programming, very much like think back to the Black Panther Party, just meeting the needs of our community, and then also shifting narratives around incarceration and harm. Because as we know, we've been force-fed a lot of ideas around the utility of prisons, so we just try to create some kind of counter narrative and show people that it's much more complex than we've been led to believe.
Awesome. Thanks, Jana. Brenda Siegel?
I am Brenda Siegel, and I use she, her pronouns as well. And I am the executive director of End Homelessness Vermont and also a policy advocate on human services issues. At End Homelessness Vermont, we started as a hotline when we were sleeping on the Statehouse steps for 27 nights, and they primarily to work with people when they are having an emergency to help them through the system. It has become a program that works long-term with people who are experiencing and living with disabilities or medical conditions, and people that have emergencies or complex situations. And we do a lot of advocacy around emergency housing and housing, but also around issues that intersect with those same issues as well.
Awesome. Great. Well, I'm really excited for this conversation. You both have really incredible experience in the work that you're doing. I think before we get into the legislative process, I'm curious, I know that especially for the issues that you are working on, aiming for really transformative progress on issues that are really serious crises in our communities. How did you land on working in advocacy, working in the Statehouse as was that your first choice as the lever that you wanted to work on? What role do you see advocacy playing, and why did you kind of decide, okay, it's time to go to the Statehouse with this issue? Maybe Brenda, do you want to start?
So when I started advocacy, I was a low-income single mom. I was working on minimum wage campaigns and healthcare issues. And really, I was just sick of being a person in poverty with no voice. And I, with some support from other advocacy groups, kind of walked into the Statehouse and started speaking to legislators and speaking up. And what I found out very quickly is that all of us are able to have a voice. We just have to be told how to step into that leadership role. Then, of course, I was the Democratic nominee for governor in 2022. And I don't think that those roles are incredibly separate once you really understand the legislative process and the way that our state government works. There is a lot of understanding of why there needs to be advocacy inside and outside of our legislature and our administration.
Yeah. Jana?
So for me, definitely did not expect to be doing legislative advocacy. I'm much more of the grassroots, run with my people type of organizer. But part of my job, I get my leadership expertise from formerly incarcerated women. In the Free Her campaign, one of our main tactics is pushing legislation. So I signed up for this. As someone who's not formerly incarcerated, I unapologetically will follow the leadership of women who were in prison. And if this is what they want me to do, I will do it. And what I've noticed, I did not have a lot of hope in the legislative process. Still not sure where I land on that. Yeah. But what I've noticed is bills can be an incredible organizing tool, and it's something tangible for people to get behind. It's easy to, when people are like, what do I do? Call your legislators, meet with your reps. things like that. It feels like a way easier introduction into the movement. And also it helps us with that piece of shifting narratives. It creates a conversation starter. It also shows people solutions and what else is possible. So that's a little bit of my genesis story into legislative advocacy.
Yeah. Do you want to add?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that those lived experience stories, and when you combine them with data and perhaps some professional advocacy, but all of it together is what actually changes the narrative. And that it has to not just be an inside approach in the legislature or in the administration. It also has to be how we talk about it in our communities and in the press. And if we're having the conversation differently, we need to kind of insist the conversation is different everywhere and bring those stories and bring that leadership of the people with lived experience. And what I found is that policy does move much faster if you're able to really weave together all of those pieces. So that has been kind of the story that I've built in my advocacy work and as well. And I think that you've experienced that as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So maybe let's jump into some of the bills that you were working on. Gina, do you want to talk about a couple of the bills that you were tracking this session and what they were trying to do?
So the first year of the biennium, we worked with Representative Brian Chena to introduce a couple bills. That was our first year in the legislative session. So we introduced a prison moratorium, which essentially puts a 5-year pause on the planning, construction, designing of carceral facilities. And ours in Vermont is unique because we wanted to not only put a ban on prison construction, but we wanted to lift the suspension of state aid for school construction. So we use that bill, once again, like how we're creating narratives to show where Vermont's priorities are. Like, look, we're able to put state funds into prisons, but we don't have the same view of the necessity of education. And we've heard, I think it's something like $600 million is needed to keep our schools up to date and for continued maintenance and repair. So yeah, that's what that bill was about. And the prison moratorium comes from the National Council. That's something their other Free Her campaigns have introduced. Specifically, Massachusetts had significant success. Last year they got the bill all the way to the governor's desk. It was vetoed, but still, just it shows you it's possible. And something Representative Brian Chena told us is he learned a lot from organizing around defund the police. And something he noticed was that introducing a solution probably would have helped with their narrative and advocacy. So he suggested, what if we do some kind of alternatives to incarceration working group? And we're like, genius. So that essentially helps put together a group of directly impacted people, experts, advocates, to see how we can shift away from using state prisons to a community-based support system grounded in restorative justice principles. That obviously did not pass as well, but it's once again a tool to show people like we're not starting from scratch. There's ways we can start thinking about different, like what different looks like. So those two bills, first year of the biennium, we didn't get a lot of traction, didn't get much support, very much had to fight our way into House corrections and institutions to testify on the bills. So we thought...
Was Brian on that committee?
No, he's on the healthcare committee.
Right. Okay.
But it's funny, they joked that he's basically part of House corrections now. He's in there so much. But yeah, so we put our heads together last summer and we were thinking, okay, maybe they don't see the process, like where we can go with this. So we introduced like a slew of legislation that kind of like is dubbed the just transition to try to visualize what it would look like to move away from incarceration. So some bills that we introduced, Representative Brian Chena introduced a few on his own, but with us, we collaborated on a bill H814, sorry, I'm glad I have my cheat sheet. And that would create grants for state agencies and organizations to provide supportive and transitional housing to folks that are justice involved and also at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness. And then H815 is a pilot program to create a medical care fund for folks who are currently incarcerated and re-entering to be able to pay for mental health and healthcare services And also a really important piece of that was that care providers would be able to go into the prison and vice versa. And what we really like about that legislation is it starts dismantling this wall, you know, that keeps us separate, that makes us think like the folks that are incarcerated are not our community. And that's something that's very important to our narrative shifts. It's like, no, we're all neighbors. These are all our community members. So yeah, sorry.
No, yeah. Well, I was going to ask for those bills. Did you and your team write those bills, or were they written by? That's something I'm always kind of curious about. Like, how does a bill actually become a bill from these like incredible ideas that you're talking about into an actual piece of legislation?
The prison moratorium was written by our Massachusetts folks and Brian, Representative Chena. Sorry, we're on good terms. So, so he sent in the language to our legal lawyers, I believe that's what they're called. So not every state is like this. Like in Massachusetts, they have to draft their own legislation. But in Vermont, we have lawyers that will draft it for us, use, you know, the specific language. So it's kind of a collaboration by everyone, which is interesting and unique to Vermont.
Yeah. Brenda, what bills were you working on this session?
So I live in the budget. I live because End Homelessness Vermont is in the budget. I also think that I've learned in my advocacy that a huge amount of change happens in the budget and in the budget language, and so I spend a lot of time in the money committees. I also
the money committees.
The money committees are. Yeah. I mostly spend time in House and Senate appropriations, which is how the money gets appropriated or sent to the budget and how we fund things. But I do spend some time in the finance committees. But the work on housing happens both in especially emergency housing happens in House Human Services and Senate Health and Welfare, and House General and Housing, and Senate Economic Development and Housing. And so when we came in, last session we had kind of thought to introduce a bill, put something together, and I will just say that Legislative Council will put together a bill if the legislators bring it to them, but also sometimes the bill gets written first and then looked over by Legislative Council by someone else that brings it in. Depends on who's working on it. But this year we were told that there was going to be a general assistance modernization. General assistance is the term used for the hotel motel housing program, the emergency housing program, which we're now calling emergency shelter, because that's what it is. It's not housing. There was going to be a modernization bill that the House Human Services was going to put together. And so we came in with ideas, we did not come in with a bill, and we kind of worked, what they did was it was a very impressive process, and I really want to just shout out Chair Teresa Wood on the process, because it was not easy. Last year, a lot of people know that it was a really, really tenuous situation, and there was a big fight to keep people sheltered. And that was very hard for a lot of people, myself included, and to work through that process. So this year, we all came in ready to be a lot more collaborative. And Chair Teresa Wood took testimony from so many people lived experience, pretty much all the providers. She really researched by listening to people who understand and know on the ground, and of course the administration. The administration kept coming in with honestly terrible ideas to basically unshelter people in the winter and unshelter everybody. And I remember very clearly Representative Wood sitting saying, frankly, it would be irresponsible for us to do what you're suggesting, and so I hope you understand when we don't. And so there was a real willingness to learn and understand an issue that perhaps they had not learned and understood before. And I've seen that before on the overdose crisis as well. And so that brings me some hope for the process. In the end, House Human Services presented a bill that was very whole. Like it brought together a task force. It made a lived experience advisory committee that was supposed to be advising the commissioner of the Department of Children and Families, which is where emergency housing is housed. I couldn't come up with another term. And it laid to rest the current rules, which are 500 pages of messy, complicated, and inhumane rules for emergency housing in February of 2025 after that was done. And in the interim there would be some emergency rules. So basically it created a process to create a better program, and in the interim it ended pieces of the inhumane program. It's still unsheltered people, and where we landed, it unshelters people. It had flaws, but we expanded the definition of disability in that to better meet the intent of the American with Disabilities Act. The administration is working pretty hard at fighting against that, using that definition as it's meant to be used. And then that passed in the House, and then the Senate took it up. I testified in both the House and the Senate on this, and lots of others did as well. And then they killed that bill in the Senate. And
And so, can you talk about it sounds like you had a good relationship. Did you have a relationship with Teresa Wood, the chair, or what do you think was the difference there between the interest in the House and the? It
wasn't the relationship, because I have a good relationship with Senator Lyons as well. It really was the priority. So the House had a priority of addressing the problems with this system and addressing the way that the administration has used the ambiguity of the system to abuse human beings who are our neighbors and community members, as you said.
When you say the House had that priority, was that coming down from House leadership, or where did you think that was
Well,
coming
it
from?
was House leadership, but I also would say that House Human Services themselves really had this priority, and you don't know the background conversations, so I don't know which direction the push started, but I do know that in the end, the priority was across the board. And Chair Wood and Representative McGill, Julie McGill, and Taylor Small, they were real champions on this issue and really pushed extremely hard to make sure that we're doing this correctly. In the end, you spend a lot of time in the budget, like I said, when you're working on emergency housing. In the end, a lot of the task force made it to the budget language, but we were only able to keep people sheltered for 80 days, plus, in addition to winter months, December 1st to March 31st, and it didn't shelter everybody. You had to be eligible to be sheltered at any time of the year. The expanded definition of disability will protect most people for those periods of time, but there was no carve out, like if you are on oxygen or you are in a wheelchair or you are a child, it doesn't matter. You have 80 days, and we will see children and people in wheelchairs and people on oxygen and people who just had heart attacks and pretty awful things. We'll see people sleeping outside because we've not fully cared for our community members.
And when is that cliff of from the current program to the rules that were?
Well, you get 80 days within a rolling 12-month period. So whenever somebody uses their first night, so if they use their first night on July 1st, that's the beginning of their rolling 12-month period. And so they can use those 80 days however they wish. However, the other and very inhumane thing that happened that we argued against pretty hard is that beginning on September 15th, there's a room cap. So they can only use 1,100 rooms, and we use 1,600 to 1,800 right now. So we're talking about people who will be eligible but will not be able to get a room because of this arbitrary room cap that causes a lot of harm. And that was suggested by the administration. It's not something that the legislature came up with, though they'd love to blame the legislature for that. And there's a really complicated and tenuous relationship between the governor and the legislature that makes it very hard for them to move. And I just, honestly, having been in there for so long, it is a pretty ugly back and forth. There's a lot of misinformation that comes from the administration and testimony. It is a really complicated process. And so if you're really there all the time, you have to just feel a lot of respect for the legislators trying really hard to sometimes move legislation that is being pushed so hard against by the administration.
Yeah. Shifting back to the bills that you were working on, Jana, did you feel, can you talk a little bit about some of the relationships that you built with folks in the building and what kind of conversations you were having with folks around the ideas that you were working on?
Yeah, so I think my experience may be a bit more unique, especially because I'm doing prison abolition organizing. I feel we've been labeled as radical, and usually radical organizers don't engage much with state officials. So it feels like we were just set up to have this weird dynamic. And also, I think some legislators, like I do believe there are a handful that are extraordinary people, but I feel a lot they're worried about the closeness to free her. So I think some people purposely would keep some distance because, you know, constituents catch wind, you're rolling with the prison abolitionists is kind of, it's a scary thing. And I know we're more of a new idea, so the relationships were interesting. I would say the only significant relationship we really have is with Representative Brian China. We do have some allies we were trying to bring in and talk with last year, but it's been very difficult to build coalition around these ideas. Once again, like, I think it's rooted in the idea that like prison abolition, it's a, what do we call, like a trigger word. Like a lot of people have a lot of different connotations about it. So I think we're still in this time of shifting narratives because there's a lot of fear. And honestly, the only reason we were able to testify in these committees were due to community outrage. Like we have a lot of supporters specifically in Burlington. So that first year of the biennium, when we were in House Corrections and Institutions, we actually went down there one day and weren't allowed to testify. And committee members were saying there was a miscommunication between them and Representative Brian China. But at the same time, we had women who were formerly incarcerated who had to take off work, had to get childcare, you know, like, so we shared that with the community and people were outraged and put a lot of pressure on committee members and Chair Alice Emmons. And I feel through that advocacy, we were given some time. And then fast forward to this year, we had Ben and Jerry's support us and they put out an Instagram campaign where they had folks fill out forms to send or emails to send to legislators and Governor Scott. And with that, we sent over 2,000 emails to legislators. So folks specifically in House Judiciary were getting a lot of emails. So we were invited in by them and then it followed with Senate institutions and Senate Judiciary. So once again, I don't think that was because of our relationships, it's because of people power. So a little bit of an interesting story there.
Yeah, and I don't think I am not always. I am sometimes seen very much the same way in my work, and so and definitely when I started doing both overdose crisis work and housing and homelessness work, there was a big desire to like sort of in a negative way call it activism and not in a positive use of that word, and really it was advocacy. You know, I was bringing in on the overdose crisis, I was bringing in lived experience. I had lost a family member. I had really ended up in a position where what I was trying to do was bring harm reduction forward, and they did not want to hear from the lived experience, but that was partially because we needed a narrative shift. And when you look at that narrative shift, at that time I was working on decriminalization of buprenorphine and there was just a few of us and we were able to get that over the finish line, but there was a lot of stops and starts and ordering. It got to the floor and it was ordered to lie, it got to the Senate and they weren't going to take it up. Like there was so much before that happened, and now here we are having a legislature that not just passed overdose prevention centers, which is part of what we were advocating for when we started, but also overrode a governor's veto on overdose prevention centers. But that happened because of a narrative shift, because we said, no, we're gonna say substance use disorder, we are not gonna talk about this as anything other than what it is, which is that people are struggling and we need to make sure that they have the support they need to stay alive. And we've done the same thing with housing and emergency housing, and through that have built relationships. I will say that it's definitely a unique and odd position to be in, to have been the Democratic nominee for governor and be advocating still. That's not something that necessarily happens that same way. And so those relationships are built very strong, but there have been very hard moments, and I think that has made them stronger. But it is the grassroots community support and the lived experience advocacy. Last year we had 200 people in the hotels write and tell their stories individually to every single legislator. So that was a huge project, and it made a huge difference because people got to know more about what was going on for people experiencing homelessness.
Right. And when you say relationships from the campaign, the candidacy that then evolve as you're shifting into more of an advocate role, you're meaning that there are people that you worked with in like, for example, the Democratic Party, who then you didn't totally see eye to eye with on housing policy?
Well, I think it's a really hard thing, and I mean this with like respect. Actually, you are in this role as the nominee, and you are like carrying kind of a line, not necessarily towing a line for the party, but like carrying a leadership role as that candidate, and then to go from that in November to a few months later saying like, whoa, everyone's about to be unsheltered, I'm not okay with that, and really become, there was a lot of behind the scenes conversations before that happened, which a lot of people don't know. They think I just like came in like, hair on fire, and that's not what happened. I came in after asking several times for it to be changed. I was good with staying home that year. And that was a really hard transition for not just me. So it was a really hard transition for everybody involved, and we had to rebuild relationships that had been previously built as a result of it. And it was okay. It was the right thing to do. We landed in a place where we're all trying much harder to understand this issue. And I think that's important.
Yeah. Gina, in a similar vein, kind of, I mean, I can imagine, are there folks at Freeher who are doing work that's different from this legislative work? Is there a way that like relationship building looks different outside the Statehouse than it does when you're trying to get something done in the Statehouse? And how do you think about the difference between those two things?
Definitely. So reimagining communities, what I was speaking about earlier, is another very beautiful way we build relationships, and that's through meeting needs. They will most likely move forward with this prison. So our thoughts are, if we create the conditions and supports that make prisons obsolete, we'll cut off those pathways into prison and take care of our people. So one of the programs we do right now is called a canteen fund, and that allows folks who are on the outside community to directly deposit onto the commissary accounts of people that are incarcerated in CRCF. And that just showing people like, we're here for you, we're here to help you with your material needs, has built so much trust with us and the people inside. And then we're working on this summer to create a community pantry, so when they come home, they can come to us for hygienic items like clothes, shoes, all those things, because many folks are released without phones, something we can talk about later, but they used to not be released without IDs. So it can be very traumatizing to re-enter. So just like wrapping them up in support and love has been a way we build relationships. And with folks that maybe not are directly impacted or formerly incarcerated, we do a lot of canvassing, public engagement with events, town halls, anything basically to bring these conversations to the community. And we utilize this method called deep canvassing, and it was really first used by the LGBTQIA movement when they were trying to fight for marriage equality. And it's more like questions based and deep conversations. So we'll pop out, sometimes you might see us at City Market or at Pride events, like anywhere folks invite us, and we'll just ask, like, have you heard about the prison construction? What do you think about that? Like, what are your fears? What would you like to see instead? And just really making sure people know that this isn't the kind of movement that we tell you the answer. Like, we're collaborating together. This is all of our movement. We're all leading it. So yeah, just building up people power and mutual aid is another way we strengthen.
Can you talk about the prison construction a little bit? Some folks may not be aware of that process that's underway. Or
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's actually underway. But.
Yes, it is underway. So back in 2019, the catalyst for all this, community providers and the media, some whistleblowers really raised the alarm about what was happening in our one women's prison. And there was a lot of sexual misconduct by staff, drug use in the facility by staff, and on probation and parole. So everyone was in a panic, and our legislators' response to this was to build a new prison without looking into alternatives to incarceration, without talking to the people that were victimized by staff, trying to figure out maybe we can release them on clemency. No, just a new prison. So in 2020 or 2021, the state put out a bid for prison construction, and that was awarded to a local or a national firm, HOK, who's notorious for this quote unquote progressive prisons. So we have HOK, national firm, and Freeman French Freeman, the local firm that's actually off of Pine Street. And so they've been working on creating the designs and have been planning throughout the last 2 years. The legislature in the first half of the biennium gave 1.5 million just for a study. And then they've allocated an additional 13 million to just continue with planning and design. And we don't even know where the site is. So that's $14.5 million that could be spent in community solutions that we could then start tracking outcomes to see, what works better, this or prisons? And no, instead we're stockpiling money for a prison. We will know where the site is probably within a month or two. They've told us it'll be in Chittenden County, near city center and the interstate on about 15 acres of land. We have some speculations about where that could be. We're thinking like Milton or St. Albans, but fully speculation at this point. But yeah, that's where we are with the prison project.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And when you spoke with lawmaker, like what do you have any examples of conversations with folks that went well or didn't go well? You said that you also testified in a few different committees. Can you share about what that was like?
Yeah, connecting to Brenda's point about the importance of lived experience in the room, we would bring formerly incarcerated women, and that really seemed to change a lot of the dynamics and a lot of the narratives. And another thing we've been pushing since we started advocating for them to figure out how to coordinate testimony of people that are currently incarcerated. We've been told that's too difficult, just a lot of answers that to me don't feel legitimate, to be honest. Or yeah, especially because Massachusetts, once again, quoting back to the Free Here Massachusetts, they were able to coordinate testimony for over 100 women in their legislative session. So if Massachusetts can do that, I feel we can do that as well. And actually so since they haven't been making the efforts to coordinate testimony, we've asked women to send us their testimony instead. So we submitted that to House Corrections and Institutions, and it was actually so bad it sparked an internal investigation by the Department of Corrections. We were not updated about how that landed, like what's going on, and we haven't heard from the woman, which makes me a little worried. But yeah, so we just try to find ways to bring these issues directly in their face so they can't ignore it. I think what's been successful is folks understanding the true conditions of incarceration and also the lack of supports when people are re-entering. Like the woman that came in was speaking about how you literally are released to nothing. And then the barriers of having a transgression, it creates barriers for employment, housing, etc. So I think just folks that are predominantly like middle class, well off, they don't really have experience with being in prison or have a family member that was incarcerated. So it's helpful just for their education to see this is the reality of our most vulnerable Vermonters.
Yeah. Brenda, what was your experience with testimony, and both testimony and conversations with lawmakers outside of the committee room this session?
So I actually testified. I've testified a lot this legislative session, but also over the years. But I did testify. I've been, like I said, this kind of conduit between the state and the providers, trying to figure out how to help people navigate these complex systems. And I submitted and gave basically a 19-page, I keep calling it a 19-page dissertation on how the GA program is currently working, and personally, and was really surprised at how much how much the legislators did hear how flawed, deeply flawed, and how much the system is failing. But then we also were able to bring in many people with lived experience to tell their stories. And we worked with them to talk through, because I always say that if you're a candidate or you're a legislator or you're a professional lobbyist, you are trained to walk in that room and tell whatever narrative or story you need to or want to in order to get your thing over the finish line, right? So we don't give that same value to people with lived experience. We just are like, go in and tell your story. We might help them figure out how to say it. But what I do often is I sit down with people with lived experience and I kind of explain the process. I explain what I have found works when I'm telling my own story, what I think weaving together data and story line, talking a little bit about your own story if you're uncomfortable talking about it, also weaving in other things that you know about the system or the program. And so we work very closely with people to give them some of that same support that somebody who is a professional lobbyist or a professional advocate has when they're learning how to do this work. And so that we found to be really, really effective and also a really successful experience for the people walking in the room. Because when I first started testifying and telling my story, it was not about as much about a personal story. It was about, again, minimum wage and healthcare. But when I first started testifying about the overdose crisis, the experience of walking in and telling the story of my brother dying and then 20 years later, his son dying, who I had helped raise. That, and then having the legislators look at me and say, thank you for your story, and then nothing changed. And that was just asking me to walk into my pain over and over and over again without having an outcome. And so I've spent a lot of time figuring out, how do we support people through this process in a way that keeps them whole and helps them to be part of making change, connects them to the moment they testify, and maybe it takes 2 years, but the 2 years later that their testimony started that change in narrative. And I think that that's really successful. And then in terms of building relationships with legislators, there is not a legislator who I will not have a conversation with, whether they agree with me or not. Because oftentimes, even if I'm not going to get them to say yes on the bill, I am going to be able to start changing their mind on the way that we're looking at the individuals whom this bill will impact or whom the budget will impact. And bringing that kind of their respect back towards people with lived experience does change the overall outcome, whether or not they say yes or no.
There's a couple of issues that are somewhat tangentially related, not directly related to the issues that you both were advocating on, although maybe you were this session. There were some issues, or some bills passed related to criminal justice and public safety, and I'm curious to just kind of hear your thoughts on those bills and how they intersect with the issues that you're working on. Jana, do you want to start?
Yeah, it was a very tough year. It felt like, especially the first year of the biennium, it felt there was more of an openness to, okay, maybe we push more folks towards diversion, we start thinking about alternatives to incarceration, but it felt like there was an intensity in the community this year where there was this fear around public safety, and that these fires were stoked. And we go into the legislative session and those fears are fully driving policy. And I watched Senator Vahovsky's episode of Under the Dome, and we found out that, was it the Burlington's Business Association? They put out a statement with so much misinformation, which was a driver of a lot of that policy. So talking about what you said, how we're trying to combat this misinformation, it was really frustrating that a group of people's fears really dominated the Statehouse, and that's something that's frustrating about the process for a grassroots advocate like me. I represent a lot of people that are vulnerable, don't have a lot of political capital in the state, So when you have business owners that have false ideas around public safety and the harm really happening in our community, you know, representatives and senators, they really respect their opinions. They know they're the ones that will donate to their campaigns and things like that. So it can be difficult to go against folks that have more political capital than Free Her in our community groups. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question there, but yeah,
no, definitely. That's really helpful. Yeah,
and I think that there's a automatic dismissal of people who are marginalized, whether it's somebody who's formerly incarcerated, whether it's somebody experiencing homelessness, automatic someone in poverty in general, someone who is in recovery or is actively using substances, that what they're saying is automatically not true or automatically less valuable than somebody who has resources and privilege. And this is part of our whole white supremacist culture. This is part of what we're kind of combating overall. And so part of this is really humanizing, which seems it's ridiculous that we should have to do that, but humanizing these individuals who are in households and families who are marginalized. I mean, we see every single day a narrative that people experiencing homelessness are criminals or have been formerly incarcerated. And actually, the vast majority have not. And even if they have, it's usually a crime of despair, or there is significant trauma in their history, or there's a lot of reasons why that happens. And so there's a bunch of intersection, and that the legislation that basically felonizes petty theft, including in children. You know, that is going to deeply impact children of color, people of color. That's who it's going to harm. And we know that. That's going to deeply impact children who are experiencing homelessness or abject poverty or have severe trauma in their lives. That is who it's going to harm. And so that isn't how we move forward. We move forward, that's not even the science. That is a bill that we are going to see the negative impacts of it fast, and they are going to have to take it back. Like, they're going to have to change that. And that I don't. The retail theft bill, yeah. I think that there is, you cannot deter retail theft by or crimes of despair by making them. They are not attractive in the first place. People that are committing crimes of despair are in despair. You have to address the despair in the first place. And that is not what we're doing right now. And so that is a bill that I think, and one of the most profound moments of the legislative session for me was listening. I was not in the room, but I was sitting in the cafeteria listening on the floor to Representative Lamont afterwards in her vote explanation, crying and saying, "You all know who this is going to hurt. And this is going to hurt marginalized people. It protects privileged people at the expense of marginalized people. And that is something that we should not want to move towards in Vermont."
You mentioned children. I know there's a policy that's been coming down the pike to raise the age of jurisdiction for family court. Did either of you work on that issue at all this session, or want to talk about that issue?
We weren't working on it, but something interesting that's also happening is Vermont, I'm sure folks know, they're building, and this is something the state likes to argue with us about, is semantics. They will call it a juvenile facility, but we call that a kids jail, you know? So they're thinking about building a kids jail in Virgins and the historical site of the Weeks School. So just thinking about how we have historically handled children in state custody, it makes me nervous that we're not having more consideration about what we do with children that may be committing harms or have behaviors that we don't know exactly what to do with. Yeah, I just wanted to flag that because they haven't really assured the public that this Virgins facility will be different from the Weeks School or anything else that they've tried to do that's always been rooted in eugenics. So just to flag that there's a lot of investment in law and order politics and carceral infrastructure in our state right now.
And that's like that is based in fear, like we were saying before. That this is these policies and these facilities are based in fear, and it is. I think where I'm hopeful is that I see this as a huge pushback towards a movement to humanize people who are in these situations. And so sometimes when people feel fear that we're changing the way that we operate in a way that may in the end create more wholeness, there is a huge pushback. And I see this as a pushback that's going to have to be corrected. I do think that there is a desire to not be seen as being part of the harm that is caused, and so I think that there will be effort among legislators to actually listen moving forward. Especially again, that floor speech was incredibly powerful. I had a legislator come out afterwards, who I won't name, and say to me, "I've regretted my votes before, but I've never regretted a vote so fast as I do that one." So I think that there is, always say, I say this about about emergency housing all the time. Last year, I think that mistakes were made. This year, I think that they tried very hard to do the right thing and move forward within the walls of a very aggressively obstinate administration, and I want my elected leaders to be willing to move forward, learn more, and change the outcomes. And I think that's a place where there is positive in Vermont, because we can talk to our legislators, because we can sit down and have a conversation and argue with them when we disagree. And that doesn't happen everywhere, and that's the good and bad of them not having staff, maybe for all of us, actually.
Yeah. So the session is wrapped up, and now we're in election season, and the next session is just around the corner, in a sense. So, in terms of the issues that you're both working on, what do you like? What's your next steps? Do either of you engage in sort of the electoral politics of behind the issues, or are you thinking towards 2025 in the next session? What's next for both of you? Do you want to start, Gina?
Yeah, we have been brainstorming around trying to put more folks on the spot about their stance around incarceration and the new prison construction. We've thought about maybe doing some kind of public forums or joining you all here with some folks and just having really transparent conversations. I think especially since folks are fighting for a seat, they may be a little more flexible about what they're willing to commit to, who they're willing to meet with. So we do plan to do some outreach. We'll see how it goes, but a lot of us are very jaded by the legislative process, so we're really focusing our capacity on like that reimagining communities, building up programming for our folks. But we will put some effort into trying to get people on the record on their stance. Yeah.
Thanks.
So right now, emergency housing is a disaster. They are working very hard to work against the legislature's desire to expand the definition of disability. We are seeing real harm caused. So I have been extremely focused on trying to fight the administration on and discriminatory action towards people with disabilities. So that's been where a lot of my focus is. I think I definitely engage in electoral politics. It would be impossible for me to say that I don't. And I am very interested in seeing people elected that are able to really hear the needs of people who have most often do not have a voice in our legislative process, for the same reasons that Jana said. I think that there's a very big challenge in feeling really jaded through that process. And I certainly have been there at times and felt just very, very broken at the end of a legislative session. And I think that but where we get to change that is who shows up in the building. And throughout the last couple of years, last couple of bienniums, we have seen shifts that are pulling a lot of our legislation in the right direction. There is a change happening right now in the Vermont legislature, and I think that that's going to bring positive improvement.
We're going to wrap up in a few minutes. Do either of you have any advice that you want to share with advocates that are thinking about getting involved in the Statehouse in the session, or is there anything that you wish that you had done differently, or what's your advice for advocates working on similar issues?
I would say a few things. So for the younger organizers, this process is intentionally difficult. It's intentionally designed to make you feel small and inadequate. So just find your people and find strength from them and know you deserve to be in that room, more so than some of the representatives. So just always stand in your strength, and also do not fall into the trap of respectability politics. I feel balancing between being a very radical grassroots organizer and having to navigate the state system, sometimes I was a little nicer than I should have been, and that's not benefiting anybody but the system. So say what needs to be said. Don't worry about the labels people will put on you. If you're doing your job right, you most likely won't be liked. So just stay strong. And also, something I wish we focused a little bit more on was coalition building. I think, prison abolition is everyone's issue, and I feel we can do a very better job at making people see that this is a racial issue, this is a feminist issue, this is a climate justice issue, and just really challenging other orgs to take this prison construction as seriously as we are. Yeah.
I think that there is, like I said, when I started advocating, I was a low-income single mom who was just really frustrated that the system was not working the way that I felt like it should for all of us. And so I just started using my voice. I think connecting to organizations that will support you in your advocacy and help you learn how to do that in an effective way that feels that feels productive and worth it to you, because it does matter if it's worth it to you when you're bringing in your lived experience. I also remembering that what seems like it is just not going to move in 2018 can become a law in 2021, and that's continuing to have those really tough conversations and have that tenacity. I always say, people have heard me say it all the time, that speaking the truth is not being uncivil, and it is perfectly civil to speak the truth, even if it's hard to hear. And sometimes the truth is hard to hear. And oftentimes I'm advocating on issues where people will die if we don't do it, if we don't resolve the issue. And saying that is just true. But it is really hard to hear. And so I think that's really important. And so the other piece that I would say is that your lived experience is expertise, and making sure that you understand that we can support you, and Homelessness Vermont can support you, Free Her can support you, we can support you in getting your voice and your story and your expertise to the right person. And so we need to, as advocates, we need to spend more time pulling and putting in front of us the people who have the lived experience, the people who are going to be impacted by these decisions. Because when you are able to use your leverage within the systems of power to bring power to the voices of people who are unheard, that's when we really get to see real change. And we've seen that on the overdose crisis, and we have seen that on emergency housing, and we can see that on the prison system. We can see that all around.
Brenda Siegel with End Homelessness Vermont and Jana Ossoff from Free Her, thank you both so much for joining us today and talking about the work you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for tuning in to Under the Dome. You can find this program and many more on cctv.org and on Town Meeting TV's YouTube channel. So long.